I wrote about in the piece on education that I wrote about this summer. On one hand, you can't, pretend students aren't using these tools because everybody sort of is. But on the other hand, I spoke to someone who'd given me this line, it would have been a little strange in 2007 if we kind of handed everybody an iPhone and said, okay, you really have to learn the technology.
Let's switch over to your article, Chatbait is taking over the internet.
So this was an article where I'd had this experience of asking ChatGPT various questions and noticing at the end of its response, it would append another question, perhaps OpenAI or perhaps other companies that are kind of, modeling their questions in this way or trying to kind of give us opportunities to understand other ways of using the chatbot that we might not naturally come to. How do we figure out this kind of question between reality versus deepfake world? I think that will be an important question to get right.
So today's episode, we have our guest, Lila Shroff, and Lila is a writer and assistant editor at The Atlantic. And she's also a recent graduate from Stanford. Mm-hmm. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the brilliant theory that she talked about in her article called Chatbait, and how AI has been adopting the addictive dark patterns from social media into their LLMs.
Absolutely. So as you say, Lila Shroff is a terrific writer for The Atlantic, writing on AI and education, ethics and technology, this amazing article about Chatbait. Our discussion will also go into AI slop, the Sora 2 slop machine, as well as discussions around the gray zone of cheating and the blurry line that has evolved there in the modern academy. So it's going to be a very interesting conversation. We are very pleased to have Lila Shroff with us from The Atlantic, who writes phenomenal essays about the impact of AI on education, very poignant and provocative and insightful articles. So to start off the interview, I'd love to ask you, where do you think is the line between legitimate AI scaffolding and cheating? Where does that happen? And you said yourself that you were in college when AI chatbots sort of took over LLMs. So maybe you can speak to that. What classroom norms or assignment designs actually you think, in other words, hold the line that are still legitimate uses of AI, or versus where do you cross over into just plain cheating?
So yeah, you're right. I was a sophomore in college when ChatGPT came out, and I kind of watched as, I think in the earlier days, in the first kind of months and then maybe year, there was a lot more uncertainty and trepidation and anxiety as to like whether using these tools in the classroom was appropriate or cheating. And I think over time, as students saw their peers using them more and more, it became much more normalized. And so I suspect that today the AI use is like way more rampant than just a few years ago. Also, as tools have gotten more sophisticated and more people have kind of become familiar. But I think this question of the line between cheating versus what's actually okay is an important one, because, I wrote about in the piece on education that I wrote about this summer. On one hand, you can't, pretend students aren't using these tools because everybody sort of is. But on the other hand, I spoke to someone who'd given me this line, it would have been a little strange in 2007 if we kind of handed everybody an iPhone and said, okay, you really have to learn the technology. So you don't want to over-index almost. But I think that, to the extent that there is like transparency between students and instructors, that seems really important. I remember seeing discussion forums where it was very clear that some students were, posting some clearly generated answers where others were trying, quite sincerely to do their own work. And then, I spoke to lots of people who talked about, more in-person conversations and more of these things that you can't really skirt your way around using AI. And I think in some cases, there's actually a hunger for that, kind of if you put the AI question aside. there was a high school student who told me that, writing assignments that prioritize people speaking to their own experiences, not just, analyze this book, but, fold in your own, you know, context of some sort is another thing that's a little trickier to move around. And she said that helped her like relate more. So yeah, I think this is a big question that's kind of all over the place, but we can, maybe go more specific too. If it's helpful.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And again, I think it's fascinating that you are so close to it, having experienced the first wave of AI in your college experience. Where were you? Where did you go to college?
I was at Stanford, so already, AI and even before I was studying this major that looks in particular at human intelligence and machine intelligence. And in fact, the concentration was called human-centered AI. So, even in the months and years before the kind of big ChatGPT moment, this was already a technology that was exciting and like somewhat hot on campus. And so there was like some buzz already. And then, of course, not only was there sort of the explosion in terms of like everybody using it, but also this being so close to a lot of these tech company headquarters, you started getting all these executives cycling through campus. And there was a lot of fervor to just some kind of thinking about what the future of building certain tools might look like.
Yeah, so Stanford, I mean, you are right in the heart of it, as you say. That's a very unique place, I think, to experience this from, as you say, because I mean, Google's right down the street, Meta's right down the street, and even X is in San Francisco. So that's very unique. And also, Stanford is such a high octane school. I mean, I'm sure the acceptance rate is something like, 4% or something like that. So you would just see it in a unique and interesting way, an interesting environment. But I want to ask you about incentives as an undergraduate, because I kind of see that theme emerging of some students feeling like I have to use, LLMs because all the other students are using LLMs. Almost feels like steroids in the baseball era of the 2000s. Like there are players that didn't even want to use steroids, but the other players are using steroids. Maybe that's not a perfect analogy, but you get the idea. There's a pressure to use it whether you want to or not. So maybe you could speak to the incentives in undergraduate education and whether you think that they're off at all between how you really want to go about your education versus, what you're incentivized to do.
I think, like anything, if the class you're taking, the material you're learning is in itself enriching and exciting to you, then of course you have a stronger incentive to put in the work yourself. If it's a means to an end, kind of a thing you need to check off to get the degree or to, you need to do the job interview prep. And so you don't want to spend hours writing that essay. As soon as it's not in itself the kind of thing you're most excited about, then I think that's when it becomes more compelling to use AI. And I spoke with a colleague who's a professor and thinks a lot about the university setting in particular. And we were kind of discussing how, in a work environment, if you are using these tools to increase your productivity, that's rewarded. That's what might get you a bonus in certain corporate settings. And so in some ways, students are just kind of using the technology as it's been designed to be more productive. And so I think it matters deeply, like the extent to which you care and connect. And I almost think that's true across subjects, right? Maybe if I love writing, I'm going to try really hard on my English essay. But if I don't really care for my physics class, I'm going to be more incentivized to use AI, which I think is maybe how cheating in general has always shown up in a classroom setting.
Yeah. So I want to ask you about the cheating thing. So here I was the head of the academic integrity committee for a couple of years here at NUQ. And it's interesting because when I was doing that, ghostwriting was a serious offense, right? In 2022, 2021, it feels like ancient history, but 2021, 2022, even 2023, some faculty could find in the metadata of the docx file that you could see the other person's name who had written it. And so that would get you in serious trouble, having someone else write your essay. But then 6 months later, a year later, it became a thing where everyone essentially has, to be generous, some kind of writing assistance, which you could argue is a ghostwriter. But maybe you could speak to that. I mean, because you were in college before, I think ChatGPT kind of took over. So maybe you can speak to that, the before and after of the norms of what we consider cheating and ghostwriting and all that stuff.
I was speaking to some high schoolers about how prevalent they thought some sort of AI use was. And they said, 85 or 90% of students are using these tools. And a lot of them, some of them in kind of overtly, that's pretty clearly cheating ways, but a lot of them in ways where it was maybe a little bit more of a gray area. And I spoke to someone else who runs a nonprofit kind of focused on AI education, literacy in particular. And he had an interesting phrase where he said, whether you call it cheating or not is almost a semantic issue, which I think depends a ton on the context. And some people may push back on that. But I think it is a good point that using a ghostwriter to write something was obviously quite taboo and not good. But then all of a sudden, the technology is so pervasive that it's quite normalized and will definitely be a part of the world people are living in. It's not as if once they leave school, this isn't a tool they have accessible. But I think I think the thing I'm maybe most interested in is how does writing education change? To what extent should we preserve the very, previous generation of super manual, do it all yourself? That to me, as somebody who cares a lot about, writing, feels really important because that's how I think. At the same time, it's is that maybe an outdated perspective? I don't know. So yeah, I'm quite interested in that tension.
You said, is that a what kind of perspective?
Oh, is it, my instinct is there's something super important about preserving this kind of more traditional writing education. But I wonder if that's something in 20 years will seem, very outmoded.
Antiquated. I mean, it is a fascinating question. So we asked, and I love your answers again. I think of all the guests we've had, you're the closest to the experience of the university, from the student perspective. We talked to Clay Shirky, who's the head of ed tech over at NYU, and he's been writing about new media for a long time. And he had some really interesting takes, including he had an article in the New York Times where he kind of pretty much made a really cogent, I think, and convincing argument along the lines of what you said, that we need to go back to the kind of foundations. He kind of says that the product of education is actually changes to your long-term memory. And I really liked that. So he kind of clarified what is the point. And you've heard other people say, when you wouldn't go to the gym and then, bring a machine to lift the weights for you, like a forklift to lift the weights for you. So it's you're completely defeating the actual purpose of what you're trying to achieve. And he also made another argument, which is interesting. He said the purpose, again, of the 4-year college experience is is identity formation. Maybe you could respond to that a little bit. What do you think about this idea that, you kind of spoke to it already, but the purpose of education is to change your long-term memory, and therefore using an LLM to even to help 50% of writing an essay defeats the whole purpose.
Making strong claims about the purpose of education feels like a hard task for me. So I think I can speak more to personal experience. But in some of my research, I did speak with people that, say, first and foremost, education at some fundamental level is about preparing people and giving them the means to eventually enter the workforce and to, contribute to society in a purposeful, meaningful way while providing for themselves. And that, to me, feels at some foundational level, people do need to, have the confidence that to pursue work, and that's like a something foundational. And then you get into these kind of maybe more romantic notions of what education can or should be in a more idealized sense that I find myself very attracted to and excited by. I think that I haven't heard the kind of the changes to long-term memory with specific articulation. I find that fascinating, and I think I want to spend some more time thinking about that. But I think for me, so much of especially like university education was a kind of opportunity to be exposed to ideas and kind of new thoughts without the direct attachment of work or something, super kind of direct deliverable. And then so I think in that way, like, I don't know exactly how AI does or doesn't factor into that, but I think that there should always be space for that sort of broadening of the mind and seeping kind of in ideas. And maybe the way it connects back is to the extent that like the kind of worst case scenario here is that, instructors are assigning assignments and students aren't really doing any of them. And there's just this kind of like surveillance to check the AI use and like students evading the AI detectors and this like kind of awful cycle that I think maybe that New York Mag piece kind of starts to get into where it's not productive for the student or the instructor. And so maybe if this is a kind of a wake up call or an opportunity to reorient away from a kind of busy work paradigm, maybe that's a good thing.
Exactly. Those are some really nuanced takes. Recently saw an interview where Neil Ferguson, who co-founded University of Austin, had said it could become a situation similar to the old saying about the communist era where we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. That's the worst case outcome. Like, in other words, the students that the faculty are continuing to assign the stuff that ChatGPT can easily do, and the students have ChatGPT do it, and everybody just pretends, and that is not a good situation. But so far we've been heavy on the doom side, which, by the way, your stuff is great. I love your doom stuff. I love your takedowns and your doomy articles. But maybe we could flip the script and talk about the other side of this, which is like AI literacy, which you alluded to earlier, preparing for success in a world where AI is not going anywhere. And maybe you could talk a bit about maybe how you envision that, how you envision AI in your work, and the case for the opposite case, which is that these students need to know how to use AI tools because that's where everything is going,
Yeah. And I certainly think of myself as somebody that I both have my moments of skepticism and concern, but also moments of optimism and excitement. So I feel like I appreciate the question. Let's see. I do sort of believe there's this, oftentimes there's concern about, we need to get everybody super literate and up to speed on the technology. But I think the, middle schoolers or high schoolers are probably already like 10 steps ahead of some of the maybe instructors or parents that are worried about making sure they're prepared. So I think in some regard, there's like a natural way in which people are quite adept are going to be fine in terms of like knowing how to use these tools and being familiar with them. So I think I'm less concerned on the like actual training. I think maybe the question is like, when I remember kind of in middle school being exposed to certain media literacy courses that would kind of, I think that maybe the best way to understand them is they were sort of like, this is how to be like a conscious or like a person on the internet today. Like existing on the internet right now is a strange experience. There's so much, people call it slop, whatever you want to call it, but it feels like the threshold between real and fake is day by day blurring. And people have been concerned about this for a while, but it feels like we're really at a point where it's just kind of a crazy experience online. OpenAI just released their new video generation social network, Sora 2, which, kind of is like a AI generated version of TikTok. And it makes me wonder, if I was a sixth grader and all of a sudden I could generate these fake videos of my friends, that could be quite funny, and it could also be quite harmful. And so I think almost some of these ways in which the technology is interfacing with people's personal or social lives, those are some of the places where I feel like there is more need to think through how do we use these tools. And then on the flip side, I think there's I firmly believe that we're very early on in terms of the kind of AI adoption, and that 10 years from now, that the way in which certain businesses are run, the way in which education might be, I think some things will change the same, but I think in particular, especially at the kind of business level, some things might run really differently. And so I think there's this sense that there's a lot of really interesting things that can be done, but that there's the kind of bridge between what can be done and what actually is being done. That delta is quite large. That's a sort of vague response, but I don't know. So I'm excited, I think.
Yeah, no, and I am too. And like you, I mean, for me, the tools have become, in a way, irreplaceable. Is that the word? If you were to take away now my LLMs, that would really hurt. Similar to how if you took away, I mean, I don't know if you've ever lost your iPhone or your phone, maybe you have Android, but if you've ever lost your phone, have you had that experience? Because it can be very painful. If you try it sometime, maybe intentionally as a thought experiment or something, because if you lose it, it's been a while since I did that too, but it's almost a part of your brain has been removed. All of a sudden you can't call anyone, you can't find anything, you can't get access to your document. You realize how much you're interfacing with this device all day long. So in a way, we're augmented we're almost cybernetic organisms. And so to your point, I think the tools have become powerful, will continue to become more powerful, will continue to be more integrated. I think for right now, they're so good at busy work. They really can do that stuff so well. And I find that invaluable. So maybe that's a positive thing about a future that we're headed toward. But perhaps let's switch over to your article, Chatbait is Taking Over the Internet. And you write some very interesting stuff in here. I noticed that myself, that at the end of every interaction with ChatGPT, and now I think Gemini does it, and I think Claude does it too, and I know Grok does it, that it asks you an interesting follow-up or suggestion. And usually they're quite good. They're quite compelling. And I'm like, oh yeah, I kind of do want that, or else you gave me an idea for another thing that I want. Maybe you could expand on that a little bit, your article on clickbait and where you think that's headed.
So this was an article where I'd had this experience of asking ChatGPT various questions and noticing at the end of its response, it would append another question. So for instance, I would say, hey, I have a headache. Any thoughts on how to fix this? And it would give some thoughts. And then it would say, do you want a 5-minute routine to make it go away? And then I would say yes. And then it would say, do you want a 1-minute routine? And so as you mentioned, I think I think one way to understand this is that there are so many potential ways you might use a large language model. And, perhaps OpenAI or perhaps other companies that are kind of, modeling their questions in this way are trying to kind of give us opportunities to understand other ways of using the chatbot that we might not naturally come to. And so in some cases, that can be super helpful. If you're at work and you're trying to come up with a brief memo and it says, hey, do you want me to come up with some better title ideas? You're like, oh, thanks. I didn't even think of that. At the same time, I think there's a way that at moments, these follow-up questions have the effect of keeping a user slightly trapped in a conversation in a way that almost feels like, if you're scrolling through TikTok or scrolling through Facebook and there's this sense that, your attention it isn't fully kind of under your control. There's this outside engine that's pulling you somewhere. And so I think maybe the concern here is that there's a world in which the infinite scroll feeling starts to become an infinite kind of conversation. And, right now, I think for the most part, there's a little bit, companies do need to prove that they can really earn money because they've put so much money into building out their AI products. But maybe there's like a little bit less pressure than there may be if, there was, as this industry matures, the need to demonstrate financial return grows. And one way that, social media or internet companies have proven themselves very skilled at doing that is, through advertising, which is predicated on user engagement. And so this article was titled Chatbait, which was sort of a play on clickbait, which is, a previous generation of ways in which our kind of attention is pulled. And I think that the core question I have is like, when you're talking to Claude or to ChatGPT or to Gemini, who has the agency to control who is in charge of the conversation? And I think that that's sometimes maybe subtle, but it is quite important in shaping kind of our experience of interacting with these tools.
And I love the title, by the way. It's a brilliant title, of Chatbait, connecting it back to clickbait and what it, essentially it's a TikTokification maybe of the LLM, as you say, with this obsession with attention and, what do you want to call it? Engagement, like the eyeballs constantly on the thing. So maybe I could ask you about, I think this connects to your writing. Obviously, this kind of went viral in a negative way for OpenAI, which was Sam Altman's tweet where he said we're going to relax the guardrails a little bit because we've solved a lot of the safety issues. And, they have whatever it is, 800 million weekly users, something ridiculous. That's like 1 in 10 people on the planet. But he said they're going to allow erotica. I think that's just, to be fair, that was like one piece of a larger thing he said that was seized upon. But allowing erotica, releasing the guardrails, and relatedly, Grok has their own thing, which is like much more directly kind of a sexualized chatbot. Could you speak to that a little bit? This sort of trend, and maybe, again, coming back to OpenAI, how it was positioned, even if we go back 2 years ago, how was Sam Altman positioning OpenAI as this very lofty thing? We're going to achieve AGI and super intelligence, and we're going to solve cancer, we're going to save the world, to this kind of new new development. Maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. So when OpenAI was first started, and for the first half or even longer than that, this was a company that was really focused on research, and you kind of think of it as a research lab. And in the moments or years now since ChatGPT came out, it's started to look a lot more like a big tech company. And in fact, I think you can point to several product developments and you say, okay, they're clearly going after social media. They're working on some hardware stuff. They just released a new browser. And so you kind of get like elements of like, okay, you can kind of see there's some Facebook and there's some Google and there's some Apple. And it kind of feels like the company is, I kind of feel like it's like in its teenage years, like kind of having like a identity crisis of like, who am I growing into? And I think there's, as we were just speaking about, like, there's clearly this need for the company to kind of figure out like, kind of commercially, like where are its main business operations. And it almost feels to me like throwing darts at the wall and seeing which ones stick. At the same time, I think something else that's interesting is that these, chatbots really are hungry for personal data. And there's this vision of like, okay, it's not just that you have ChatGPT, which you copy paste in an email and then you say, write the response to the email. It's, you have this, one assistant that is consuming your emails and calendar events and your reading and maybe your conversations. And it's this sort of like omniscient technological presence of sorts. And so it seems also that, a company like Meta, a company like Google that already has a ton of data on you is better positioned to create that hyper personalized assistant. And so they're trying, one way to read it is like perhaps they're trying to combine the kind of large customer base that they have, or user base they have, with the sort of need to figure out the kind of, data question. And then on the safeguards, I think that was an announcement that recently like provoked a lot of chatter, I guess, online. And I think one thing that, I think it's interesting to see how these safeguards have evolved over time, and where certain companies are kind of willing to draw the line. And so, there's a lot of difficult questions to be figured out. And I think in part, when you have 800 million users, there's so many different use cases. And so, I think the line between like, I don't have good answers. I think it's a very complicated question.
No, you have great answers. These are really, really, really interesting. And you brought up the data point. Yeah. So if you watched, I don't know if you watched the Dwarkesh Patel podcast, he's become kind of famous for his really well-researched interviews with and technically focused interviews with AI people. And he has a take that I basically agree with. I think is kind of self-evident, which is that AI tools are not that useful. LLMs in particular are not that useful if they don't remember who you are. It's like a 51st dates thing. We've interacted a lot. I've told you a lot of material, shared material, but now I have to reintroduce myself in the new thread. And that starts to get annoying. Of course, it's just a limitation of the technology, but obviously all of the companies know that and are working on that, so that memory is a big thing. And if you can solve memory, then it could become this very useful, personalized assistant. It's like someone that, like a really good employee that knows you really well. So maybe you could talk about that. I mean, I guess you did just speak to that, but maybe develop that a little more in context of OpenAI having just released this browser, which on the one hand, I'm trepidatious, I share your concerns, but at the same time, it's also kind of exciting that it could be an awesome user experience. So what do you think about that, this idea of the need for memory and the trade-off with your personal data, or rather, like how much it knows about you, and then maybe even this browser thing?
Yeah, I feel that trade-off very acutely, because on one hand, I've seen that when you have those memory features enabled, the experience of using the tools is quite different than when you don't. And so there's a way in which I'm pretty eager to experiment with that and have that enabled. At the same time, I have two concerns with memory. One is, I think there is some natural discomfort of having all of your data aggregated in this one place. And something I've written about before is like, my Google search history might be mildly embarrassing at times, but I'm not, putting in, here's a, long email exchange. Here's a really personal question. I think people use chatbots in ways that maybe would be more revealing if their, chat logs were to leak. And so the idea that, my medical records and my email exchanges and my conversations with my friends are like all in one thing, I think there's some questions I have there. The other concern I have about memory, and I think this is like pretty understood within the AI world, is that when you have this memory feature going, sometimes the kind of accuracy of the responses you're getting, things start to get distorted. So if I say, I ask about, I'm at a restaurant and I ask about some dish, and then later I'm, trying to figure out what to buy at the grocery store. There's a way in which it like sort of the memory feature then encourages the chatbot to kind of over-index on certain preferences you might have in scenarios that might not be appropriate. And it can be super subtle so that you don't even really notice it's happening. Another example is you might say, hey, I'm worried I have this medical condition, and you have some exchange with it. And then later you say, oh, my ankle is really hurting. And it's like, oh, it's probably because of that medical condition. And that might not be the case at all. And so it starts drawing connections in this slightly different way. This is a kind of simplified explanation, but I think that's like a problem, a technical problem that seems like it needs some figuring out. So I think with memory, it can be exciting and it can be cool, and also comes with a lot of questions. And then I think on the browser side, it just came out, so I actually haven't had the chance to experiment with it yet. But I think that the idea here that seems to be cropping up with a lot of these AI browsers is that text or, natural language, even more so than now, is kind of going to be the interface with how you navigate the web. So, if you use Perplexity, for instance, it is a pretty different experience than searching Google. You're doing a lot less time scrolling and browsing and a lot more time articulating the thing you're looking for. And I think that can be very helpful at times in getting you to the right destination quickly. But there's also something that is perhaps lost when, it kind of, to me, implies that instead of going between different sources or something, people are going to more likely be routed to the same places. For publishers, there's a question of like, okay, if people online are just seeing the summaries and they're not scrolling past my website, that's a very different way of engaging with information. And so I guess the question is like, to what extent does that experience of using the web, are you just consuming the summary, or are you still kind of clicking through and navigating, right? It's almost like, are you at the bus stop and like people are coming to you, or are you like out walking through town being the internet? Sort of convoluted way of thinking about it. But it'll be really interesting to see if these AI browsers take off, or what they look like when they do.
I think that is so interesting. The idea of a natural language browser, it's just going to really completely change the game. I think ChatGPT or OpenAI, they really keep Google on their toes. I mean, that's going to, I can imagine if this thing is successful, which I think it will be actually, Chrome will just change the same way they kind of freaked out and added the AI mode. My intuition is they're going to wind up chasing, the success of this over time. The whole idea of the death of the 10 blue links is kind of what we're talking about, right? That's where it's headed in a way. The world that we grew, I mean, I'm older than you, but I remember the last, 20 years of the internet has been that experience. You go on the browser, you search for the thing, and then you sort through the links. It's not necessarily the best user experience, actually. It's just the one that we are used to and made Google a $1 trillion company and everything. But I can actually welcome a world where we don't have to do that. It will probably be a more intuitive user experience, actually. But it's also going to disrupt business dramatically, the way advertising is done, the way businesses try to get found. But then maybe I'll ask you about journalism, because you're a budding Gen Z journalist, and you're at the beginning of your career. Where do you think this is headed in terms of how journalists may frame their careers in the future? I mean, again, the death of the 10 blue links and this move toward this natural language browser.
So there's plenty of questions, I think, to be asked about the kind of business models of media companies and whatnot. And I think that would be a separate podcast. So I'll put those questions aside and kind of focus specifically on the task of being a journalist, because I think that's what I feel closest to at the moment. And I think that, on one hand, you might reasonably say, hey, if you spend all day writing and here are machines that can write, aren't you worried? And that would be a kind of a well-reasoned question. On the other hand, I think that the core of journalism is reporting, and it's talking to people, and it's having conversations, and it's sort of uncovering new information. And that's something, this is the line that I think a lot of people will tell you right now, but that's something that AI is not very well positioned to do. You can certainly imagine ways in which, you could have chatbots reaching out to people or something, whatever, but like, is ChatGPT going to walk off my screen and like go knock on somebody's door and ask them a question? Like, no, not right now. So the reporting function, I think, very much remains intact. And like that feels almost more important in this world where like producing writing that is, the best writing will be connected to the real world, and it won't just be this kind of like automatically easily producible stuff. And then I think there's also, we're a few years into this, and it feels like there's almost a hunger for these models can write very well in certain regards. I operate under the assumption that they will actually continue to get much, much better at writing in the coming years in ways that, right now it's more surprising when it can do a new mathematical task or something. And I think the writing will continue to improve, but a little bit more in the background because we're already kind of think of it as being good at writing. At the same time, it feels like that, a really good writer will bring so much individuality and like their specific lens of the world, and the experience that is filtering through that lens feels so distinct. And I think that there's like desire and a hunger for that. So I think, I've seen some pretty good writing from LLMs, but I haven't seen I think we still aren't quite at the point yet where it feels like the writing is like totally the best kind of human level writing. So there's also like, yeah.
Our first guest is named John Gibbs. He's at the University of Georgia, and he had a very interesting claim, which is that the jobs that may trend back in the future, and by the way, we asked this of other guests if they agreed, and they did not agree. Some of the guests did not agree, but I really still like the claim that there will be a trend back to more offline type jobs and activities, theater, live music, that's painting, right? That maybe there will be a renewed interest in the kind of humanities as a result of maybe burnout with all of this AI stuff, synthetic writing, as you say, and the AI slot machine that is Sora 2. To be fair, I mean, some of the stuff on there is cool, but also you can also see how that could become dystopian. So maybe I'll just ask you about the Tillie Norwood thing. Maybe we just pivot to the movies for a moment. Did you see the Tillie Norwood phenomenon?
I'm like generally aware. I'm not super up to date on the details, but I know kind of what's happening there. Yeah.
So maybe just your thoughts on that. This idea of Hollywood generating an actress. I mean, it wasn't Hollywood. It was a production company that made her with the express purpose of making her a celebrity in Hollywood. I guess it could have been done at any time before, I think, but they did a great job with like the PR of it. I mean, it's controversial, obviously, but they got a lot of attention for it. And so back to your point about, I think, the authenticity of writing. I mean, would you watch a movie with a bunch of AI actors and actresses, or is that not compelling to you?
So I think there's actually a lot of parallels between writing and the film industry here. I think people, at least myself, have a hunger for the human in all its various, regards. And I think that I would, if I was on Netflix and it said, hey, here's a movie starring 20 AI generated actresses, and here's one starring 20 real people, I'm going to click the real people one. So I don't feel in the same way if I say, I go on to a magazine and they said, here's an AI generated article and here's the human written one, I'm going to click the human one. I think in this film example, let's say we fast forward 10 years and all of a sudden that the, film AI generation is so far advanced that it's not just little clips, but full movies. And I don't know that I'm watching that. Like if we get to a point where I cannot tell the difference, I think that then it's sort of the preference starts to vanish, because there's almost like a mental barrier where like if somebody handed me a piece of writing that was AI generated and they didn't tell me that it was AI generated and I thought that it was human, I don't think I would have any like, barrier as to reading it. It's something about like the knowing that it is not real that I think creates this. It's like when you come across like a large block of ChatGPT text, your brain sort of you skip over it. You're like whatever, and you go past it. But surely you're coming across AI generated writing that isn't being, blatantly. There's no sign saying this was ChatGPT, and you don't think anything of it. So yeah, I think it's very much about like, do you know how the thing was produced? And it feels like right now in the film world, we're in this moment where, something like Tillie Norwood, it almost feels like there's like a stunt, like we're going to do the thing that feels a little bit taboo, or of course it's going to be provocative. Of course it's going to, create some tension or drama online. I think that over time, maybe it will feel a little less stunty and a little bit more just like a thing that is happening. And obviously that's like, there's huge questions for artists and creatives about what their futures look like and how they're being compensated and whatnot. So a lot to be sorted out.
For your forecast of the future, maybe 5-10 years into the future, again, for me, I can't see that far into the future at the rate at which these things are changing. You can only make guesses, but what are you most excited about, and what are you most concerned about in terms of trends we're seeing and where we're going to be in 5 or 10 years?
Sure. I'll start with the excitement. I think that, so I'm not somebody that thinks AGI is coming in 3 years. I do think that there is like a lot of exciting potential, in the sciences and health, in particular, where it sort of feels like we don't really know what the cool things are going to be, but there's probably going to be some really cool things, and it won't be AGI, but it will be, all the cool, people always say, you couldn't have predicted Airbnb and Uber when the iPhone came out. Which those were both complicated platforms, which had both positive and negative effects. But I think in the same way, it feels really impossible to predict the things that will be coolest and most exciting. But I feel confident that there will be some really interesting innovation. And then I think on the concern front, the general kind of like icky slop-like feeling that the internet seems like it's kind of getting worse. And so I think that I would like to live on an internet that feels happier and like an exciting and fun and generative place to exist in, and not one that feels kind of bad and gross all the time. And so I think how our social media platforms evolve, our information sharing platforms evolve, and then how do we figure out this kind of question between reality versus deepfake world? I think that will be an important question to get right.
Absolutely. Maybe just one last question. I'll ask you, what is your next article? Because your articles have been so provocative and incisive. Do you have a new article that you are cooking up?
I'll be a little bit vague, but I'd say I've spent a lot of time thinking about kind of the actual tech culture and like who are the people building and working on these products. And I think that's one thing I'm really excited about. And there's a long list of stuff. So sort of, I think, we'll see what's next.
Thank you so much, Lila, for a fascinating conversation. It's been amazing.
Thank you. I've really had fun.
Well, that was a very interesting discussion with Lila Shroff. As advertised, we discussed her theory of Chatbait, which again is a really insightful, original kind of comment that she has on a new pattern in LLMs where they essentially try to ask you a leading question at the end of every sort of interaction.
Right.
And it's usually quite persuasive and well calculated, actually. And so you could argue that that's a bit of a dark pattern of reminiscent of the infinite scroll of TikTok.
Absolutely.
In other words, the implementation of sort of, behavioral psychology, or that slot machine phenomenon, behavioral psychology that TikTok and Reels use, and YouTube Shorts, to try to make sure that you never leave the platform.
Because of that never-ending conversation, it kind of feels like it's subconsciously trying to feed it more information, which at the end of the day, that's what LLMs, are built on, right?
Yeah.
The more information you feed it, the more it will give you. But in order for it to give you, you need to keep giving back that information, which makes sense to have that loop for LLMs. But then for us as, people, whether we're in academia or we're students or, creatives, right? What does it mean for us to recognize that pattern? And is it something that, we should take into consideration when using LLMs? Or is this something that, it could just be something that we're passive about and it's okay? What are the implications that come with that loop that LLMs are creating?
Yeah, it's part of the AI literacy and then being intentional. So one phenomenon I've noticed is usually the question that it asks me is provocative and interesting, but it's not the question that I actually want to ask.
Right.
But it usually, nevertheless, somehow subconsciously keeps the conversation going.
Yeah.
So I'm like, you asked that question is not quite right, but actually I had this other question.
Right.
So it works in that sense. So we're seeing that phenomenon, and I think it's a real phenomenon that she's observed, and she's coined it Chatbait. Another theme that we've noticed and discussed in our conversation with Lila is the trade-off between memory versus privacy. So on the one hand, the more that the LLM knows you, right, the more it can be helpful and effective.
Right.
It's just like hiring an employee. Like when you first hire an assistant, let's say, the first 6 months or so, there's just a lot of things that they're going to not intuit, right?
For sure.
Get wrong.
For sure.
So it takes a while to learn you, to anticipate your needs and your habits and your thought patterns and so on and so forth. So memory becomes the key to being a truly helpful assistant, which is like what Sam Altman's stated goal is of ChatGPT, which is to be super helpful.
Yeah.
But the trade-off, and we discussed this with Lila, and it's very interesting, is in order for that to be useful, it has to know a lot about you.
Exactly. And this is where the issue of privacy comes in, right? And if you are not literate in AI, this could be an issue, because what are you open to sharing with that LLM? Because when you're using an LLM, it's basically a conversation between you and the LLM, and there's nothing else that exists within that, realm. But the data that you're feeding it is being used elsewhere too, inevitably, with the responses that it generates for you. But also it is using it to generate responses for other people that might have similar concerns or similar questions, right?
Oh yeah.
So, right. So at what cost are we training these LLMs in terms of keeping the concept of memory in mind and being happy about the fact that the LLM recognized or remembered what I was talking about last time, and we're picking up a conversation where we left off from 2 weeks ago, right? But when it comes to privacy, what is at stake here?
And think about the big players. So Google and Google Gemini 3, which just came out, is arguably the smartest LLM right now. Google has more data on humans on Earth than pretty much any company in the world.
Yeah.
But X has Grok, and Grok has proprietary access to all Twitter.
Exactly.
And Meta,
exactly,
of course, with Llama, even though they're behind in the sort of LLM race, nevertheless, they have some of the most valuable data in the world, which of course is the data of Facebook, Instagram, and even WhatsApp. So it's a kind of mysterious thing. What are they doing with this data? And where is the differentiation between how the data is being treated for social media platforms or search versus now it's being treated for these conversations people are having with LLMs?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think more than ever, AI literacy is, very crucial and should be implemented in some shape or form in curricula in different, educational services or institutions.
Yeah, it has to be at the forefront of education moving forward.
Yeah.
Mindfulness, being intentional.
Yeah.
And as much as possible, understanding how these systems work,
absolutely,
treating your data. Even though, to be honest, to be transparent, I don't think anyone actually does know how they are treating our data.
That's the thing. I'm not sure people read the terms and conditions and, what they're agreeing about.
But even more than that, I believe that the rules around data with LLMs is being made up as we speak.
Absolutely.
Whereas, like, if you think about Facebook and their notoriously long terms of service, that at least has evolved over the course of 20 years.
Yeah.
The way that whatever terms of service that actually exist between you and OpenAI are kind of an evolving, mysterious thing.
Right.
And another important theme that we discussed with Lila is the icky slop feeling that the internet seems to be developing. And some people say that, at some point in the near future, the majority of the content that you encounter on the internet, whether it's text or video, will be AI generated. And so there's a kind of icky feeling, and that's kind of a vibe check thing, but that's what she was discussing, and I think she's onto something, an icky feeling that we see growing. And we discussed the concept of Tillie Norwood, who was the first kind of, I think, AI created actress that has a Hollywood agent.
That's wild, honestly.
And whether or not and then it's interesting that it actually connects back to our discussion with John Gibbs.
Right.
John Gibbs made the point that there was some threshold that was crossed at some point with the Marvel movie franchise where you would watch CGI characters having a battle scene and then no one would care.
Yeah.
And so we can connect that to what Lila is saying here, where we're discussing whether or not people will watch a Netflix show, let's say, where all the actors are AI generated.
Right.
And what are your thoughts on that? Will people watch that?
I personally don't think that I would have a big audience. I think there would be an audience, just given the fact that people out there do have, AI friends or AI assistants or AI, brainstorming buddies if you're a creative, right? But there definitely will be a specific audience for that, but I don't think that would eliminate the bigger percentage of audience members that would want to consume films that are featuring actual real-life human beings, right? So I think it might be a genre of its own, if anything. I mean, with film festivals, for instance, there are categories now or genres in festivals that are purely AI related, films that were done using AI. Yeah. So this might be a similar thing where there might be a genre on Netflix that is AI films. Who knows?
Well, my take is slightly different, so let's introduce some controversy.
Yes, let's do it.
I think that it's going to start to blend. Rather than there being a category of human Netflix shows versus AI Netflix shows. I think we're just going to see them start to blend. And in discussing with Lila, the question was at some point, do people stop caring? And I think you're making the point that people will care, will continue to care. And John Gibbs made a similar point too, and he mentioned, people should, there will be a renewed interest in theater and live music and painting. And so I think that's an important question coming out of conversations, is whether or not we'll cross a threshold at which point will people care or not care that AI is creeping into, and or let's say half of the cast of the show is AI generated, for example.
Right. Well, we're going to have to wait and see what happens.